Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about The Lake She Lies by Harry Hawk. And let me see, I gotta get my checklist out here. I got some notes. So let's go ahead and, actually before I say anything else, let me move my microphone here. Make sure I have a little more, y'all can hear me clearly. Alrighty. So let's see what we got in terms of this particular book. So it's written by Harry Hawk. It was released on October 1st of 2024. Let's see. I think it's about 226 pages, although I'm not sure about the 6. It's really bad, sorry. Now, there's some violence and there's some gore. I would consider this a book for, I'd say mature audiences, you know, people who can handle things like gore and some violence. But I'm not really sure what the age range is. I would say adults probably a pretty safe bet. So this book is, I'd say the genre is kind of like a coming-of-age story, and at the same time, it's also kind of like a survival type thing. So I know in my Substack review I said that some of the films that it reminded me of were things like, actually I'm not sure I mentioned this, but The Outsiders is actually something that I thought about recently, which is the Francis Ford Coppola, I think it's Coppola, the movie about, like, you know, the children who don't really fit in society. Also combined with things kind of like The Perfect Storm and The Grey, which The Grey is a Liam Neeson movie where they crash in Alaska and they have to survive. So there's different elements. It's definitely a unique type of story, though. Anyway, I guess that's more of like a little bit beyond introduction into, like, you know, plot and everything else. Anyway, the setting is contemporary. I think it's Duluth, Minnesota, which my friend Morgan will not let me live. Slight exaggeration, unless I mention the fact that that's like the hometown of Bob Dylan. And I think at one point in this book there actually are like Bob Dylan lyrics, or they found like a Bob Dylan album or something like that. The setting is also, there's an island on Lake Superior, and there's some spots in the wilderness. There's a little bit of, they're on a boat for a while, so, you know, they're on the lake. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not moving this thing here, my bad. Okay, so, yeah, that was the setting. The setting is Duluth, Minnesota. Now, the characters, there's the primary character, the POV character, is a guy named Dylan. By the way, all these are like adolescents, like teenagers. There's also Whitney, Peter, John, and a guy called Slim. And all these characters, in their own different ways, have sort of been let down by either parents or society in general. In some ways, these characters reminded me of a show that came out, I guess I'm dating myself here because I remember when it was new on the air, but The Wire had a season that was about really like school-age children and how the system was letting them down, the adults in their life were letting them down, and in some ways it kind of reminded me of that, but it's different because it's like, you know, they're up north, they're not in Baltimore, and there's some difference, but in terms of like the characterization, it kind of reminded me of that. But they're each unique, and they're pretty well done. Now, in terms of plot, let's see. The one comment I did write down here was that the plot did take a while to sort of pick up. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people, these days, they call it like a slow burn type of thing. And I think that's really what's at play here. It really seemed to take towards around, say, the midway mark to really get going. But it's not like the first half, I wouldn't call it wasted time. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad thing. What I would say is that the action parts of the book really happen in the last half. And the first half is really kind of like a build-up towards that. So the prologue begins with a flashback. And Harry Hawk does have a very good opening hook for this book. I gotta give him credit for that. Looking at it in kind of like a different way, one thought I did have is that if this were adapted, like if this were to be Hollywoodized, I'm not sure if that's even a term, but if they were to make it into like a movie, like a White Squall or something like that, I think they'd probably have it start at a certain point and then have like a bunch of flashbacks, kind of like the TV show Lost, something like that. But in any case, let's see. So the survival elements did remind me of The Grey, but I kind of already mentioned that, The Perfect Storm. Also, there's another film called Into the Wild I think it came out in 2007. Actually directed by Sean Penn, who's an actor. But this book did remind me of a lot of films that I've seen. Okay, now moving on, we've got themes. So one of the themes here is really that society is kind of phony. It offers a lot of false promises in terms of what does or doesn't make someone successful. It seems like there's really a lot of false promises that society is offering. There's a clear theme of rich versus poor, and one thing I do remember is, well, I don't know, not to make this too much about me, but I grew up kind of, let's just say, underprivileged in the South, and definitely there are people who, if you really want to go back real far, they used to call them carpetbaggers and a lot of other things. A lot of four-letter words for really rich people that come into town and they buy up all the land and kind of price out the locals. Funny thing is that I know there's well, not funny, but unusual, I guess. It's happening a lot lately, I think, but if you really look back, it's happened historically an awful lot. There's a lot of animosity between rich people and poor people, and I know when I lived in certain towns, I'm not going to say where exactly, but a lot of times the locals kind of feel like they can't buy a home in their own hometown because the prices have all been driven up by rich people. And it's not just that, but there's clearly some classism. Sometimes rich people aren't exactly nice to people who have less money than them, especially if they have a lot less money than them. I don't want to go off on a rant on bashing rich people, but I did find that particular theme quite relatable. I'll just leave it at that. Let's see, the other thing is, the promise of freedom is a lie, is what I wrote down here. And although we're not on the plot anymore, I thought about something later on, which was, there's a book called Lost, with an exclamation point, not the television show from 2004. It's a book written by a park ranger in the 90s, and he wrote that book based upon being a park ranger, and I think that was the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, for something like, 40 or 50 years. And it was just stories of people who just more or less vanished. In many cases, they just vanished without even a single trace. And I think there was something about the themes that reminded me of that book, which was that young people, in this book Lost, the park ranger mentions how young people have this innate curiosity, this boldness to push the limits of what they can physically do. And in this book, it seems like the idea of going out into nature is, because looking at the back blurb of the book, this isn't really a spoiler, but they take a boat out into the lake and then they end up stranded on an island. And there's something about nature that offers this, I guess you could say, illusion of freedom, because nature is actually just as unforgiving as the phony society they're fleeing from. And I think that's really the lesson that they learn in this, is that whether it's the phony society that pretends to be fair, or nature that makes no such illusion, or I guess it kind of did until they found out the reality of it. There's the promise of freedom is not really free. Like, there's a price you pay either way, or at least that's maybe what I thought Harry Hawk was going for. I can't be entirely sure, but it seemed like the young men in this book didn't really belong in the phony society, and they also didn't really belong in nature either. Both of them were, in different ways, unforgiving and untenable, and maybe not untenable is the right word, maybe more like inhospitable in their own way. Anyway, that's really all I had noted down. The one good thing about this, well, I'm not going to say good thing about the book, the one theme that was good, that was explored. I'm not saying the other themes were bad, the silver lining and the almost like the tragic themes was the friendship aspect that developed between the boys, and that was probably the one thing that, it's not like a hopeless view on reality. I'd say that, among the themes that are kind of like, hey, the world's a phony place and nature is cruel, it wasn't all down, it wasn't all depressing or bleak, I guess is the word. Anyway, I'm sorry. I could probably just blabber all day if I don't move on to the next thing. So, I don't have much here for Inside the Author Studio. Harry Hawk does have a bio on Goodreads, and I just looked at that briefly, and looks like he wrote the book. At the end here, he has a small section at the end where he talks about why he wrote the book, and he came across a few I guess you would call them rowdy or misbehaving youths in Duluth at one point, and he wrote the story based upon what he thought their lives could be in a fictional universe. It's actually a pretty clever idea, I gotta admit. But, whenever you base a character off of someone you've seen in real life with their mannerisms and such, it seems like you're probably going to have a pretty good character. So, I thought that was pretty interesting. The guy is from Minnesota, by the way, the author, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so the critique I have here is the pacing was a bit slow at the beginning, and some things at the end were, I would say, a little too much for me, but it wasn't really, I wouldn't say it's a bad book. I think it's a very good book, actually, in a lot of ways. But, come to think about it, I should probably just move the critique section to, later, because it's hard to talk about, things in the book without spoiling it, and there's a spoiler section later, but I'll get to that. So, conclusion was that it's a pretty good book. I'd say it's unique. I haven't really read anything quite like it, because it has those elements from those other stories, like The Grey and The Perfect Storm and The Outsiders and such. And I haven't really seen a combination like this. So that alone, I think, makes it worth reading, in my opinion. Okay, the spoiler section. Yay. So there were a couple things in the story, and I guess this is kind of like the critique section, but I never like critiquing. But anyway, there's a point in which Dylan pulls out a gun and points it at his friends while they're on the boat. And I did think that he needed to have some provocation to do that. I thought that was a little too much to just pull a gun on people. But then again, Dylan is kind of a very impulsive person. He probably is someone who, I don't know, I guess he would do something like that. I guess I was just a little shocked at that moment. There's also a point at which, I'm not sure if I can find it, but there were just so many coincidences where someone almost noticed where the boys went. And what they ended up doing is something would happen. For example, there's a guy, when they go to steal a boat, there's a guy who's guarding the rich people boats, I guess is what you would call them. But he looks back and sees that there's a boat missing, and he's like, oh well, I'll just go to Arizona, retire or something like that. It was kind of and if that happens a few times, it's not a huge deal. It seemed like there was a lot of times a character would be introduced and they would just not... Anyway, I'm sorry, I can't find it in the book, but there's a point at which the guy who owns the boat notices that his boat is missing, and the police at that point know that these 5 boys have gone missing, and he literally has a heart attack on the docks. And again, I'm sorry I can't find the exact page number, but I remember writing in the margins and in my notes that it actually kind of, to me, got a little bit comical, the number of coincidences that occurred where these boys were literally just within seconds of someone at least providing information that would have led to their location, but at the last minute something happens. In fact, at the end there's actually a dude, an old guy, building a lighthouse, and he leaves literally a minute, I think, before Dylan, or actually seconds even, before Dylan's able to arrive and try to get him to stop, because they're stranded on the island. The lighthouse is on the island they're stranded on. Also, kind of a bit of a puzzlement that the old guy's there working, and yet there's I think there's a couple convicts on the island with a pack of wolves that are hunting them, but they leave the old guy alone. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what that's about, but for some reason it reminded me of if you play a video game with, I don't know, something like zombies. I don't like zombies, by the way, but you show up somewhere in the game and the zombies are attacking you, but there's inexplicably I don't know how to say it. I'm sorry, I'm bad with pronouncing things. Inexplicably, there's some survivors you find somewhere, and you're like, well, how did these guys survive when they were surrounded by a million, hungry wolves or hungry zombies or whatever? But I guess I'm kind of splitting hairs here, because the island did seem like it was somewhat large. I don't know. I guess that's kind of something that I can't fault too much in, or can't find too much fault in. But anyway, at the end there. They find Dylan in a boat, and they know that there's 5 boys missing, and the radio, the guy who calls in seeing Dylan in the boat, mentions the island he's drifting away from, but they don't search the island until Dylan tells them where they're at. And I thought that was really weird, because a long time ago I knew someone, in fact I knew more than one person, who was in the Air Force Reserves for a while. And he told me about search and rescue, how they did a training exercise where there was supposedly, quote unquote, 2 people missing. It's just a training exercise, it's not for real. But when I think he said something like when he did that exercise, because I think he was, I don't know if he was an officer or what his deal was, but he said he was like running the exercise and they, found quote unquote a survivor. And he said he felt like Tommy Lee Jones from that, was The Fugitive, where he's like, all right, so like we found a survivor and I want like a 50-mile radius where we're going to search every, boathouse, house, residence, shed, outhouse, like that whole spiel from The Fugitive where Tommy Lee Jones is going all, insane about how they're going to search literally every structure within a radius. And so my first thought was, well, Dylan was reported as being in a boat and there's 5 boys missing. Why did they not do a really wide radial search? I mean, I know it's a big lake, but assuming that they're not looking in the water, if there's a small boat that he's on, it probably came from land. Like he went somewhere and that boat had to come from somewhere. So it would be logical to look along the shoreline for, well, gosh, where could he have come from? And if they find that island, but anyway, I guess I'm not sure if I would call that a plot hole, but I would call it a plot hole. So anyway, just my opinion, I suppose. Now, the other thing was that at the end there, I think the parents were on the search chopper, and I was like, gosh, I'm not sure what the reason for that was, because that doesn't seem like something that they would allow, because I'm pretty sure the reason they don't allow that is because the parents are emotionally invested, and in a way, the story itself actually has dialogue where basically what happens is that they have a search and rescue chopper. They're searching for the boys. I think they're running low on fuel and they have to go back, or the weather's bad or something. And one of the parents says, no, I'll write you a check for so much money if you don't leave and continue searching. And unless I'm gravely mistaken, in reality that would not happen because they wouldn't let the parents be on the search and rescue chopper. And it's for that very reason, because they're emotionally invested and they're not professionals who can be objective and make these decisions. Anyway, the criminals on the island, I really wondered how they survived, because, like the boys are barely surviving as is. And that was probably one of the things that seemed a little bit unusual. Much like with the rescue chopper, though, I can see the value narratively in putting it in, even though it kind of breaks the reality a little bit, like the believability of the world, like the suspension of disbelief. And the reason why is that I thought on it later, and the criminals that they find on that island, to me, seemed like a mirror image of who Dylan probably would have become. And I think it's always good writing when you present an antagonist that is an extreme version of the protagonist if they don't change. So in that particular sense, I think that does serve the story pretty well. And so even though I'm kind of like, how is this guy in a pack of wolves surviving on an island where there's like basically nothing to eat? But I don't know, maybe they arrived recently. And besides, it does make for some decent tension, But anyway, I'm sorry I had a whole list of things. I don't mean to make it seem like I'm spilling shade or throwing tea or whatever it is. I think it's the opposite. But the truth is that I actually really like this book a lot. And I do recommend it if you like, stories like this are really, if you're looking for a around 200-page book to read over the summer, this is probably one of the good choices available for this particular summer, or any summer after this. I don't know, maybe I'm making this video for people in the future. But anyway, I guess that's really all I have today. So that's all, y'all. Anyway, check out The Lake She Lies by Harry Hawk, available on Amazon. And I guess I'll see y'all next time. So long.